And people should start coming in.
Okay. Good evening. I'm Bill Kopper, so please come on in. We're going to wait just about a minute so some other people can enter before we get started.
Yeah, they're coming in rather rapidly now. I think you can invite people to put their names in the chat and tell us where they're from.
Good evening. I'm Bill Kopper. Thank you for coming to hear our fourth climate speaker in the climate series, Ermias Kebreab. And we are recording, so you will be able to get the recording at a later time on the Cool Davis website. The YouTube collection is at livecooldavis.org. And if you have questions, please put your questions in the chat. And it would be helpful maybe if you put your name on the questions, and that way Professor Kebreab can address you directly. So I'm with the Davis Friends meeting, and we're one of the sponsors of this series. The Friends are also called Quakers, and they're a religious denomination that separated from the Church of England and settled early in America, primarily in Pennsylvania. Friends focus their energy on working for peace and social justice. Tonight, I'm your host for our climate speaker, Ermias Kebreab, who will discuss his groundbreaking research that may help us reduce greenhouse gases. First, let us begin with the land acknowledgement that will be read by Lynne Nittler.
Good evening. This is the UC Davis Land Acknowledgement Statement. UC Davis pays homage to the indigenous people and land on which the Davis campus is located. We should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized tribes. The Patwin tribes, Kachildihi, Kachidihi, Band of Wintun Indians, the Calusa Indian Community, Kletsil Dihi Wintun Nation, and Yocha Dihi Wintun Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands.
Thank you, Lynn. The ongoing Climate Talk series is hosted by the Davis Friends meeting, the Yellow Interfaith Alliance for Climate Justice in Cool Davis. The talks began with a speech from the noted science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson, followed by Mark Reef, who spoke about climate change and capitalism, and then Professor Hugh Safford, who spoke about fire trends in California. All the talks are posted in the YouTube collection, as I mentioned before, at livecooldavis.org. Tonight's talk will be posted soon after the program. Professor Ermias Kebreab is speaking today on the Green New Deal. While many people know that farm animals produce a lot of methane gas, a potent greenhouse gas, most people are going to continue to eat meat and consume dairy products, just as they continue to drive their cars. Ermias Kebreab's remarkable work offers a way to substantially reduce the release of methane gas from beef and dairy cows. Ermias Kebreab is Associate Dean for Global Engagement in the College of Agriculture and Environmental Science, as well as Director of the World Food Center at UCD. Dr. Kebreab conducts research on reducing the impact of animal agriculture on the environment, particularly greenhouse gas emissions globally. Dr. Kebreab's research has been recognized by the scientific publications and news media worldwide. There was actually an excellent article in the San Francisco Chronicle about his work a few months ago. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Ermias to address us, and you can use the screen share if you need to for your slides.
All right, so good evening, everybody. So hopefully everybody can hear me and they can see the slides. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation to come this evening to spend some time with you to talk about the Green New Deal. What I would like to do is basically start off with a little bit of discussion about why we consume animal source food, and then we go into the environmental. So instead of jumping right into the environmental aspect of it, I think it's good to remind us why in the first place people like to eat animal source food. Although animal source food are really good source of protein, protein is not really the only issue we have when we're trying to nourish us with animal source food. Micronutrients are extremely essential for health, and a deficiency of micronutrients will have a lot of consequences for health. And animal source foods are some of the only dietary source of vitamin B12, preformed source of vitamin A, heme with iron, which is 25% absorption. If you are taking iron from plant sources, you will need quite a lot of amount of iron because it's not easily absorbed, and vitamin D as well. So these are really the only source that you can get. Those are from the animal source food in natural form. It's also a major source of various micronutrients: thiamine, riboflavin, vitamin B6, and vitamin E. And also the zinc that we get from the animal source foods are much more bioavailable as well, so we are able to take it in easily. And contrary to what we might have heard, it's not easy to replace those micronutrients through fortification. The absorption is very low when you're trying to fortify food. The absorption is very low because a lot of those micronutrients kind of depend on each other. You have to have enough of one to be able to absorb the other. So because of all this complexity, it is not easy to simply add vitamins and other micronutrients into a plant-based diet and expect that you will have the same amount of microminerals. And I think one thing we need to remember is that when you talk about nutrient deficiency, a lot of people think about low-income countries, but micronutrient deficiency is prevalent in the US as well. So this is from NAINS data, from national data, that shows that quite a lot of people are deficient in various micronutrients. The biggest one is iron. I think it's about 25% or so of women between the age of 15 to 49 are deficient in iron. The vitamin D and B12 and folate are also people have deficiency in those macronutrients. There is correlation here, and so where if you look at how much animal source food is being consumed in different countries around the world, and what is the stunting level, particularly for children, you can see that very clearly the countries where there is less amount of animal source food being consumed, mainly because of they're too expensive, you see a much higher rate of stunting occurring, while in countries where there is higher consumption of meat and animal source food, you see much less incidence of stunting. And if you look at what are we eating compared to what is the recommended, how much are we do we need to eat, and looking at the recommendations. So in this graph, on the right-hand side is the percent of population that are consuming above the recommended limit, and then on the left side of the zero is the percent of population that are consuming below what's recommended. And so what are we consuming most of is sodium, saturated fat, and added sugars. This is really the issue with obesity and other dietary problems, is because over 80% of people in the US are over consuming salt, but 70% over consuming sugar. On the other hand, if you look at dairy, it's about 5%, less than 5% of people are over consuming. Actually, over 80% of people in the US are under consuming dairy. They're not having enough dairy to meet their requirements. Same thing with vegetables also, so about the same, but 80% are not consuming enough vegetables and dairy products. So we have to put this into perspective as well. All right, so let's now go into the main issue of the day, which is we're talking about the environmental impact. So what is the environmental impact of animal source food? So if you look at, so this is a global kind of number. You have about 14% that is attributed to agricultural production, the greenhouse gas emissions. And if you look at the breakdown of that, you will see that the majority, by far, is ruminant enteric fermentation. So this is the topic of the day that we're talking about. Why we are interested in is that the majority of those emissions from agriculture are from the ruminant enteric fermentation. Plant agriculture and animal agriculture is about 50-50. Especially in the US, you will see overall is 10% agriculture, about 5% animals, 5% plants. And then within the animals, the majority is ruminant enteric fermentation, as you can see here, about 33%. And then some ruminant waste on pastures, and manure management is about 9%, although it depends where you are. In California, because of the weather, the contribution from manure is much more than the 9% you see at a global stage. And then you have other sources from plants, particularly from rice. It has about 16% methane, particularly in paddy rice. And then you have other issues from using fertilizers, and then energy that's been used on the farm as well. So that's why we're talking about today is the big chunk, the 33% we're talking about of the ruminant enteric fermentation. And coming down to the US, so where does methane come from? What are the sources of methane? So the biggest source basically from animals, particularly enteric fermentation and manure management. So if you combine the two, livestock will have the majority of methane emissions, and then you have some from natural gas and petroleum, about a third of emissions, and then you have landfills and coal mines and things like that. So this picture will be a little bit different for California because we have less natural gas and petroleum, but we have more animals. So enteric fermentation probably about 30% in California, and petroleum will be less than that. And one of the reasons that we are also really interested in this is because we do have a Senate Bill 1383 that mandates short-lived climate pollutants, particularly methane emissions, to be reduced. So it doesn't matter where they come from. So all origins of methane in the state will need to be reduced by 40% by 2030. So we have that mandate. So we're trying to figure out how do we do that. So this is quite unique in California. You don't see this anywhere else. I mean, there's a lot of sort of voluntary reductions and around the world, but I think this is it makes it quite clear what needs to happen when it comes to methane emissions. So let's step back and see where does it come from? What do we mean by enteric methane emissions? Well, It's mostly from ruminants, and this is because the ruminants have this unique ability to convert high fiber, particularly cellulose, break down the cellulose and produce quality protein and other macronutrients. So during this breakdown of cellulose, there is a formation of hydrogen in the gut of the animal, and that hydrogen needs to be released. And the way that the animals have worked out over the millions of years of evolution is that there are methanogens, other part of another group of microbes that they utilize hydrogen and carbon dioxide to build their cells, and they produce methane as a byproduct, and that methane is then eructated out from the animal, mostly through belching. About 95–97% of the methane produced is coming out through belching. So this is why we have methane emissions. It's very natural way, and this is the way that the cow is dealing with the fermentation. And what does it mean in the atmosphere? What's the cycle, the methane cycle? Where does it come from? Where does it originate? So methane basically has a carbon skeleton. So the carbon that's being consumed by the animals from the grass and other feed, when they break it down, and as I mentioned, the methanogens convert some of it into methane, so that methane is released into the atmosphere, and methane stays in the atmosphere for about 12 years. So that's the average time in the atmosphere is 12 years. And then after 12 years, it reacts with hydroxy radicals, and then it is converted into carbon dioxide. It comes down and is taken up by plants, and then it goes back into the animal. So there's this cycle that's going on. So if we don't increase the amount of methane, or if you don't increase the number of animals we have, we actually don't affect the atmosphere. So when methane is released, well, while it is in the atmosphere for about 12 years, it's much more potent than carbon dioxide, but it breaks down. It's not like carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for thousands of years. So whatever carbon dioxide you put in now is going to be there for 1,000 years from now. While methane, what is being put out today, 12 years from now, is destroyed and converts back to carbon dioxide. So we have to make sure that we don't increase the stock of methane in the atmosphere. So this gives us a really good opportunity. If we reduce methane, what it means is that we can actually reverse the effect of climate change, and will really help us in trying to stay below the 1.5 degrees centigrade that the Paris Agreement wants us to be. So there are some methane mitigation strategies that have been done, and that are some under development as well. So this is where I would spend most of the time today. So there are different ones ranging from feed additives to changing the chemical composition of the fiber, and changing the ration, and using lipids, and then at different stages of the animal, there are other things that you can do at birth, and even before birth, there are things that you can do through breeding as well. So I'm not going to go through all of this mechanism. I'm going to touch on the ones that have already worked, and the one that I think will work as well. So let's see what has happened in the last 50 years. What has happened when we look at the methane emissions? Is it compared to 50 years ago? What are we doing? So this is a life cycle analysis that we have done for California, and we compared 1964, which is the red bar, to 2014, which is the blue bar. And greenhouse gas emissions come from different sources. We have emissions coming from feed production. When you need feed to animals. When you produce that, there is emissions associated with that. Farm management, basically the equipment that you use in the farm. Enteric methane, I just explained what it is. Manure management, that's coming from manure. So these are the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see, there has been a tremendous progress over the last 50 years. So I'll go through this one by one. And so what has happened is that over the last 50 years, there has been a 45% reduction per unit of milk production. So a gallon of milk that you're drinking today is associated with 45% less methane emissions, or less greenhouse gas emissions. This is actually a very conservative estimate. We're talking about 2014. Now already we are now 7 years ahead. Things have changed. This is probably even more now. And we're talking mostly enteric methane. We haven't really included reductions in carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide. And there's a continuously changing that's happening that help become more efficient and reduce emissions as well. And water use intensity was reduced by 88 to 89.9%, with water reductions of about 90% in crop production. So the way we are doing crop production now is much more efficient in terms of water, and so we were able to reduce this about 55% from housing and milking, and about 54% in free water intake. So improved genetics, crop genetics and management have helped us to large efficiencies in water utilization. And land requirements for crop production were reduced by about 89% in 2014 compared to 1964. This was mainly due to dramatic increases in crop yields in the last 50 years and the greater utilization of byproducts in diets and reduced inputs such as fertilizer and pesticide use. And the land savings are roughly the same size as the state of Connecticut. So the increases in milk production per cow through genetic improvements and better nutrition, animal care, have contributed to reductions in land and water usage, fertilizer and pesticide usage, as well as less energy for irrigation or operation of farm equipment when we calculated per unit of production or intensity basis. So California has a specific advantage. What did we see lower greenhouse gas emissions from California compared to other regions? And the answer is that California dairy farms typically use greater amount of byproducts compared to other regions. We use a lot of almond hulls. If anybody has been to any dairy farm, you will see mountains of almond hulls that you won't see anywhere else. And all that byproduct is fed to animals that actually upcycle the waste that would have been thrown out or sent to a landfill. So byproduct use in the average feed in cows' lifetime in California, we calculate was about 49%. So almost half of what the cows are eating is byproducts, which is much higher than 30% in other regions. So the byproducts were treated as residues and they don't carry any emission burden for production, but obviously there will be some burden for transportation to the animal facility. So we went from 3% byproduct use in 1964 to almost 50% use in 2014. Right. So now let's talk about the other mitigation strategies that are not implemented in fully, but could be implemented and may have some changes. So one of them is if we use lipids and plant extracts. And in the US situation, this is actually, we are almost on the maximize this, but the rest of the world has not. So we did a simulation of what would it look like if a lot of countries around the world were to include more lipids in the diets. And the answer is that there's a lot of potential in countries where there's high ruminant population. So the top panel is in 2030 and then goes to 2050. And you can see that places like India and China, Brazil, you have a lot of potential to actually improve this and reduce methane emissions, greenhouse gas emissions quite substantially. So just by adding lipid into the diet, you'll be able to reduce the emissions quite a bit. And the ones that are really exciting at the moment, and I hope that this will be a reality very soon, is actually the use of inhibitors that directly affect methanogenesis or the methanogens. Things like seaweed and 3-NOP are the ones. So I will talk about those two in much more detail. So the story of the seaweed actually started in Canada. It was a farmer in Prince Edward Island. He noticed that the cows that were foraging on the seaweed seemed to do better. And so he contacted a scientist around there, and they did some screening, and they found that one particular seaweed called Asparagopsis taxiformis had a potent antimethanogenic activity, and they thought that might actually work quite well. So what they did was they did a laboratory study in a test tube. Basically, they put in different type of seaweed. In this case, the top one being Asparagopsis, a red seaweed, and then a green seaweed. And then they put them in a test tube, and they kept them for 72 hours and see if there is any reduction in methane emissions. And from this graph, you can see, particularly in panel B, there's quite a big reduction. After 2% dose of the algae, basically there was no methane. So it basically methane completely got eliminated. And this is, remember, in vitro. So this is in a test tube that was done. For green seaweed, it didn't work so well. So you have to go like 75% to be able to see any kind of effect, which is, you can't feed 75% seaweed to a cow. So that's not going to happen. But Asparagopsis was very interesting because at 1% and 2%, I mean, it was really having an effect. So we looked at it and we thought that the mode of action seems to be plausible. So we started working on this, and we decided to do a trial. So this was the first ever trial done in dairy cattle anywhere in the world. And so we conducted this trial in our dairy here at UC Davis. And what we saw was amazing. Like we saw a methane reduction by 67%. So that was until that point, I have not seen anything that reduces methane emissions by that much. It was really unexpected. It's a reduction that we saw, and this was 2018, so about 3 years ago. And there was a lot of interest from all over the world, and major media outlets reported it. And I actually want to play a little bit. Hopefully this will work.
It's breakfast time at this dairy farm at the University of California, Davis. But this cattle feed contains an unusual ingredient, seaweed.
We mix it with molasses, so it's a nice little sweet treat for them. We try to mix it as well as we can into their feed, but we have some cows that'll pick it out, and we have some cows that'll go right for the seaweed.
They don't need the seaweed, then we won't see any reduction in methane. UC Davis is testing whether seaweed can reduce emissions of methane, a potent greenhouse gas that's released when cattle burp, pass gas, or make manure. Dairy farms and other livestock operations are major sources of methane. That's why California is requiring them to cut emissions by 40% by 2030.
Reducing methane ultimately means reducing greenhouse gases and reducing the impact of climate change. So it affects everybody in the globe.
This is a wild Atlantic kelp. Before feeding seaweed to the cows, UC Davis researchers tested in this lab where they can measure emissions in fermenters that simulate cattle stomachs.
And we can test the effect of different feed additives on the gut microbiology.
Here we have some milk samples.
They also test milk samples for flavor and nutritional values. The methane content of the cow's breath is measured when they stick their heads in these feeding machines. The first study of the seaweed diet only involved a dozen cows. The early results show promise, and larger studies are planned.
And so far, it's very encouraging. We've seen over 30% of reduction in methane emissions.
Around the world, dairy scientists are looking for ways to reduce cattle emissions by spicing up their diet. They've tried garlic, oregano, cinnamon, and even curry, with mixed results. At the University of Wisconsin, researchers are studying how a cow's breed, as well as what and how much they eat, affects their emissions, which they measure with this treat dispensing device.
The machine draws air from the breath of the cow, and the machine continuously
measures the concentrations of the methane in the air. Really, what drives the emission from the cow is how much the cow eats. Because the more the cow is going to eat, the more she needs to process that feed, and the more methane she's going to produce.
Researchers hope seaweed and other food additives can help reduce emissions and make dairy farms more climate friendly. Terry Che, Associated Press, Davis, California.
Okay, so that was about 3 years ago, and then when we have that result, we actually had even more questions than answers. And so the question was, what would happen over a long period of time if you give it for 3-4 months? What happens? Do the microbes adapt to it? And how stable is the active ingredient? How long can it work? And then would animals would consume it? Is there any palatability issues? So to answer this, we did another trial. This time we did it with beef cattle, and we extended. So the first trial was they were exposed with the seaweed for 2 weeks at a time. This time we extended it to 21 weeks, so almost 5 months, and then we had about 7 animals on each of those 3 treatments. We have 3 treatments. One is, so we have a control, so a group of animals that do not have anything else except just a normal diet. And we saw this curve where at the beginning there was high methane and then it went down. This is quite normal because we changed their diet towards the end, becomes more concentrate, and then we would expect that the methane would be reduced. But when we add about I would say an ounce of seaweed, we saw the amount reduced quite a bit. And then when we add even more, up to 2 to 3 ounces a day for each of the steers, in this case, we saw a reduction that's up to 80%. In some cases, it was over 80% reduction. So this was actually, it worked much better than dairy. The main reason is that we changed a different species of Asparagopsis, which is more potent, and we saw that there was a reduction of 80%. So the other good thing about this is that it also increases the feed efficiency. So this is a work that was done in Australia, and what they've seen is that animals that got sort of the meat or high, that this again 2 to 3 ounces a day, they have seen that their average daily gain has increased, and their feed conversion efficiency has increased as well. So this makes sense because methane has carbon in it. So if you reduce methane, you save carbon, and that carbon then could go into body weight or milk production. So this is a win-win situation where you reduce methane, but you increase the productivity as well. I was going to show you another video of the latest experiment from NBC Bay Area News. That was like two weeks ago. So I think you can find it on the internet. But there's going to be a new one from CBC 13. If you are in, most of you, I think, are in Davis and Sacramento region. It will be aired on May 20th. May 20th at 10 o'clock. There will be a special on this. There's also another special on ABC that's featured mostly on climate, and this has been part of the solution. So, what's the impact of using something like this? Well, the average net reduction rate is about 32% for seaweed. So what I'm talking about here is looking at the whole life cycle from the dairy industry, because the methane only is about 80% or so, but then the greenhouse gas does not only come from methane, there's from others as well. So when you account for that, for the dairy industry, what it means is that if you use seaweed, you will be able to reduce 32% of the greenhouse gas emissions or the carbon footprint from that dairy. If you use another feed additive, I haven't discussed this in detail because we don't have the time, but we have another compound called 3-NOP. This is developed by a company called DSM, based in Switzerland. And 3-NOP basically reduces emissions by about 30%. And there has been about 20 to 30 trials that was done all over the world. And so it's pretty consistent in terms of how it reduces it, and it does not affect the animal. There's no problem in terms of the animal weight or production. It only attacks the methanogens, and there's a reduction in methane emissions. So if you look at the whole sort of industry-wide, about 11.7, so close to 12% reduction in emissions. Another way to reduce methane emissions is providing alternative hydrogen sink. In this case, if you provide nitrate as feed additive, you will be able to reduce by about 20%. But if you look at the industry-wide, it will be about 4% reduction. Nitrate is a bit tricky because if you feed it too much, it could be toxic. So there are other work that's going on right now to try to come up with a solution where some of the metabolites that become toxic are actually utilized by bacteria. So if you feed nitrate with a bacteria that can utilize those metabolites, then you may be able to use it as a mitigation factor. So what does it mean in terms of impact? So the greenhouse gas from California, for example, how much can it be reduced? Well, it can be reduced maybe 6 billion carbon dioxide equivalent as a 3-NOP, about 2 billion CO2 equivalent. Sorry, the first one is with seaweed, the second one is with 3-NOP, and the third one with nitrate is about 1 billion. The 3-NOP and the seaweed, they work in a similar way, so we can't really sort of double dip with the two of them. But with nitrate, it's a different way, and you will be able to use that as well. So again, these are some of the few examples that I've shown you here, but there are a number of other feed additives that we have tried at Davis. At the moment, as we speak, we are trying 3 feed additives at our dairy barn, at our beef barn. We're looking at biochar. This biochar was actually sourced from a farm here in California. So it was a farmer who was really interested in that, was actually supporting this work. And so we are conducting this work at the moment. We are working on another additive called Mutrol that we've done first time, and we saw about 23% reduction. So we're doing that again. We are also working on another feed additive called Agoline. And Agoline is actually essential oils. So it's a blend of essential oils that has been shown to reduce emissions by about 10%, but we hope that it will be approved for methane mitigation as well. So it's actually been used now in California, but it's used to improve productivity, not to reduce methane. So I showed you this picture at the beginning, where the ruminant, enteric, and fermentation being quite the majority of the emissions coming from. And by using different feed additives, so the seaweed, probably 80% or more. You can do 3-NOP, you can do Mutrol, you can do a blend of Mutrol and 3-NOP, or Mutrol and seaweed, and we have a number of different combinations that can be worked out. So by what we know, we should be able to reduce this substantially, so that a big chunk of that emission of methane could be offset, and this is part of the way which the livestock industry and agriculture in general is trying to get into carbon neutrality. There's a big sort of carbon sink from using pastures in rangelands, and on top of that, if you are actually able to directly reduce enteric methane emissions substantially, then I think the goal of getting into carbon neutrality or climate neutrality by 2030, by 2040, I think that will be achievable. And the state has said that they will want to be carbon neutral by 2045, and all sectors of the economy have to play a role in that. And I think the livestock industry will be ready by that time to achieve this carbon neutrality. And just the sort of for fun, we did a a calculation to see what happens if the world were to follow California's lead, and we came with an estimate of 1.73% reduction in total. This is the total global greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced if everybody else is doing what we're doing here in California. But of course, it's very difficult to achieve. There's, you know, the different things, different resources and all that that will prevent it from happening. But the trend is there. I think the trend is that things are improving. There's reduction of emissions happening per unit of production, and now we are also have direct methodology to reduce emission as well. So this action alone would almost twice as important as our state's effort to achieve net zero. So with that, I just want to acknowledge my graduate students who have done a lot of this work. Without them, wouldn't be able to do any of the research. So all the research is actually being carried out by graduate students and interns and undergraduate students, and of course also the funding from very different sources within California and internationally. We would not be able to do this work. So I just want to acknowledge all the sources of funding that we got to be able to do this work. Well, if you have any questions, I'm sure you have a lot of questions, so I'm more than happy to try to answer them.
Well, thank you very much. That was a really enlightening presentation. And it seemed like you were getting along really well with those cows, and they seemed pretty happy to eat the seaweed along with their food. And do they get to eat that the cinnamon and what was it, curry very often with their meals?
Well, we are doing a lot of different things at the moment. I mean, the Mutrol, for example, is a garlic and citrus extract, so you can actually garlic and citrus. Some of the essential oils are actually quite nice. Like we tried lemongrass, for example. It smells quite nice. So unfortunately, it didn't work for us, but we're looking at sort of different species of lemongrass that might actually work. And the other thing that we're trying to do is other byproducts that are available in California, particularly grape hummus and olive hummus is our next thing. So next year, hopefully, we'll have some data to show if we are successful reducing emissions through the feeding of those byproducts.
Well, we had a few questions. One of the questions was whether, this is from Rebecca, whether methane content is greater if the cows are fed soybeans or corn.
Oh, well, I think usually the cows are they have a balanced ration. Soybeans are not fed to cows all that much these days, but so soybeans is a source of protein mostly. You feed soybeans for protein and you feed corn for energy. So because corn has more fiber and the degradable fiber, there would be more methane. But you would want to feed them sort of in combination. You have to have a certain amount of protein, so 18% or so is protein in their diet, and so you have to make sure that you balance that out.
We have another comment or question from Johan Verink, and he's asking, how is the manure composition and quantity changing when algae is fed to the cows?
So we looked at the manure, and we have not seen any changes in the manure composition or quantity. I think we are actually working on it right now in terms of what is in the manure, but particularly if there is any kind of algae and active ingredients are passing through the manure. We are working with folks at UC San Diego, so we give them some manure from our experiments, and so they are analyzing the manure at the moment. So I don't have a full answer for you, but I don't expect there will be that much of a change.
We have another question here from Rebecca. What about the cost of the farmers of these feed additives? Will they be willing to adopt this new feeding regime?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because it needs to be cost effective. If it's not cost effective, then it's not gonna happen. So one way we're trying to help farmers to cover the cost of seaweed is by helping them claim carbon credit from the state. And the way we do that is by developing a protocol to be able to participate in the carbon exchange market. And so if we're able to have a protocol, they can use that protocol to show that reduction by using seaweed or something else. They can reduce emissions, they can reduce carbon, and so that carbon reduction, they can take it to the state and they can get compensated for that. I think that way it will help in covering some of the cost of the feed additives. Or some feed additives like seaweed, they improve productivity. So you actually reduce your cost of feeding the cows, and that way some of that cost could be used to pay for the seaweed as well. At the moment, we don't really know what the cost of those feed additives are. They're keeping it close to their chest, most of them, and so we don't know, but they need to be cost effective if they're going to be used widely.
We have a comment here from Lori. Very exciting research. What issues do you see before it can be used by dairy farmers?
I think it needs to be tried in on-farm basis, which is actually happening. The Strauss family creamery is doing that in June, July. They will be doing an on-farm trial on their dairy. So that needs to happen to make sure that the reductions we see are applicable in a real world scenario as well. And then it needs to be approved by FDA. Unfortunately, when you're reducing methane emissions, the FDA considers that it's a change in the animal's behavior. So whatever you're doing is you're giving a drug to the animal, and so seaweed and others, any feed additive is now considered as a drug, which means you have to go through a clinical trial and all that. However, if it is approved somewhere else for the US, then there will be a precedent, and it would be much easier way to try to pass it through the FDA legislation process.
Okay, we have a question from John. What would be involved in ramping up the algae production to full scale?
Yes, so there are, I know at least 3 startup companies that are working on this right now. There are 2 in the US, Blue Ocean Farms and Symbiosis, and then 1 in Australia, Future Feed. I'm sure there are some in Europe as well. And they are trying to understand how to scale this up. This seaweed is not as well known as others like kelp, and so there needs to be a time to try to understand how and what are the conditions and it grows in, and that's happening. I was told that by the end of the year we will actually have an announcement about how quickly and how well the scaling up can happen. And some production in a sort of aquaculture setting in Hawaii has begun already. So I will think with a lot of investment that's going into it now, we should be able to get into a scaled up production pretty soon.
Are they growing it like in big swimming pool type vats?
Yes, yeah. So yeah, there's the aquaculture, because you need to try to control all the environments, and so that's how it's been grown. But I'm not sure how many crops per year they will be able to do and what conditions. And then if you improve the quality, you don't need as much as well. So now we're giving 1 to 3 ounces. You probably get away with giving them much less than that, depending on the quality.
The other question from John was whether there would be some CO2 emissions associated with the growing of the algae, and if that had been taken into account.
Yeah, of course. I think there will be some CO2 emission associated with that. On the other hand, there will be also CO2 that's removed from the soil as well, from the water as well. So during the production of seaweed, it will take out nutrients and carbon from the ocean, and so there could be an offset of that carbon dioxide that's been used for machinery, building the whole thing, and transporting into the farms as well.
Okay, then we have a question from Roberta. It seems surprising that seaweed would be helpful for cows' production of methane. Is there an evolutionary reason for that, do you think? Some old evolutionary connection?
Well, the reason that the seaweed is doing that is the specific one is because it has an active ingredient called bromoform. It is a halogenated compound that is analogous to methane. And so just the chemical pathways of how we form methane is blocked by this methane analog. And so that's why the seaweed is been, just one species of seaweed is being effective against that, because for defense purposes, this seaweed contains this bromoform, and other predators, I guess, they don't like it, and so I think for the algae, it's a defense mechanism, but that compound happens to be similar to the enzyme that is needed for the methanogenesis, and so that's how it's blocking it. But I don't see an evolutionary connection between the seaweed and methanogenesis.
You don't see any connection between the seaweed and evolution, is
No.
what? Yeah.
No.
Okay, so we have another question from Benjamin. Would people be willing to pay more for climate-friendly milk?
Well, I don't know if people would pay more, but I think it could be done in such a way that if farmers are compensated for reducing emissions, then the burden will be on everybody. So and there is this carbon exchange sort of program, the carbon offset program at the state level, and what it's trying to do is to reduce emissions and basically trying to maybe penalize the ones that are emitting more, and then the others that are reducing can take advantage of that as well. So as the amount of greenhouse gas emissions emitted are being kept lower, then there are companies, transportation, energy, that would need offset. They would need to buy to offset their carbon emissions. So if farmers are reducing this, that carbon that's been reduced can be sold into this market as an offset, and so that farmers are compensated through that program, and so the consumers don't have to bear that cost.
Okay, we have another question from Johan. How much is the methane production from one cow per day? You calculated with for methane emissions in California. Did you break it down to one cow per day?
Well, I guess it depends. So in terms of liters per day, you have about 600 or so liters of methane per day, but then you have to convert it into grams and energy wise as well. So that's a little bit convoluted calculation, but I mean, I'm happy to send that calculation to you. At 8 o'clock at night, it's a little bit to do that kind of calculation.
So 600 liters, and then you'll have to calculate the amount of grams. You think it's a kilogram?
No, it's in grams. I would think it's probably about 400 or so grams a day.
Okay, and a question from John here. How does the carbon footprint of plant-based milks compare to that from cows? That would be, things like soy milk or oat milk, almond milk, those types of things.
Yeah, so the issue is that they are not the same. Nutritionally, they are not the same. You're not really comparing apple to apple, right? So if you have a liter of soy milk or almond milk or oat milk, and they have a dairy, they're not the same. The dairy will have it will have more protein, and it will have all the micronutrients that I described at the beginning, while the plant-based ones will not have them. Some of them are fortified, but will not have them. And some of them have actually added sugar. I was actually reading an article yesterday from the New York Times, and they were saying that in some cases, like in particularly oat milk, because it's, and almond, because it's not going to be as sweet, they add sugar. They actually have more sugar than you would get from a donut.
In oat milk.
Yeah,
well,
yes.
I've never been impressed with oat milk. It doesn't have any protein in it.
Yeah, so the protein also, I think, like 2 grams or something like that, compared to like 6-7 grams in milk. So, comparing, on what basis are we comparing them? That is the issue that I have. I mean, if they were nutritionally the same, then yeah, you can compare that, but they're not the same. I mean, they don't give you the same amount of nutrition, and so it is a challenge to be able to say, this will reduce it and this one would not. And also when you there's going to be a byproduct when you do almond, when you do oats and all that. There's going to be a byproduct. Where does that byproduct go to? It goes to the dairy, right? So without the dairy, you're not going to have a plant-based milk anyway.
Okay, so we have a question from Aubrey. Very interesting talk. What is so special about this red algae? Do you know the mode of action? Also, do you know what happens to the cow's microbiome when they eat this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we're actually working with the microbiologists now. We've taken samples of the rumen, and we are doing transcribing if there is any change happening in the microbiome. So that work is happening at the moment. So I'll have to address that when we got the results. So my PhD student is almost finishing, and she's doing that work at the moment. In terms of what's special about it is because it contains bromoform and other halogenated methane analogs, and we do know the mode of action. Well, we're trying to understand even more, but what we know so far is that this bromoform is responsible for it, and it is similar to the enzymes that is required by the methanogens. So it inhibits those enzymes, and so the methanogens cannot continue to form methane. And so in vitro studies have shown that the number of methanogens have been reduced. There's not as much methanogens happening because they're not getting that enzyme that they needed to convert into methane. But more work we're doing right now. We are working with a scientist in Spain to do very, very detailed experiments on how this is happening, and the breakdown of the active ingredient itself. Does it show up in the product or not, and what the mechanisms? So all of that we are working on that aspect.
And so the cows didn't get a stomach ache or anything like that from the red algae.
No. We didn't see any issue. Like the steers, we kept them for 5 months, and there's no problem. And at the end of the 5 months, also we looked at their composition, body compositions, was no difference, and the taste also, the meat that came from them. We had 112 people as panelists, and they did not detect any difference in taste as well.
So we have a comment from Johan. He said it's 0.71 kilograms per cubic meter.
Okay.
So there you go.
Thanks.
That's from an engineer. And so from Rebecca, again, this seems like a great example of a transdisciplinary effort, nutrition and biology and horticulture and economics. How did you make this happen? Is this the kind of creativity we need for science to ameliorate climate change?
Well, I think, yeah, these days we really need to work together. Multiple disciplines have to come together and address this issue. I think just looking in one field of study, it doesn't cut it anymore. I think the solutions lie when you are combining all this knowledge from different fields of study and put it together, and we may be able to come up with solutions that are transformative.
Okay, and here we have from John, another plant-based question. Is cow's milk required for human nutrition?
Well, it is part of the dietary guideline. So dietary guideline recommends that cow's milk has to be part of it. And put it this way, I mean, cow's milk is probably the most balanced food that you can get. The most diluted, but it's about 13% solids and 87% water. But the solids and the amino acid profile is perfect for humans. And I give it to my to my children. I every day I make sure that they have some animal source food, because particularly the first 1,000 days, it's really important that children get adequate nutrition. So I think the requirement is you don't have to have milk. No, I mean, there are people who are lactose intolerant and they don't drink milk, but it's not just about milk, it's about animal source food. You can get similar things from eggs, for example. You can get similar things from meat. So animal source food in general have higher and better absorbable nutrients. So so you don't have to have milk per se, but if you can, then you get a much better balanced nutrition. For the amount of protein, for the amount of micronutrient, there's not that much energy there when you consume milk. While in other cases, if you want to get the same amount, you're gonna have to consume quite a bit.
And we have another question, another sort of statement and question from Johan. It is nice to see how an observing Canadian farmer initiated a change in science. Learning by observing, seeing, doing is still how change happens. The devil is in the detail, but should have one focus: controlling global warming. How do I know my own impact? The only impact I can change myself.
Yeah, I think that we are all we need to do our bit for sure, but I think reducing intake is I don't think is one of them, because we need nutrition, and we need nutrient dense foods as well, and it depends. I mean, if you are over consuming, obviously you have to reduce it, right? But in the US, the only group of people that are over consuming animal source food are males between the ages of 19 to 51. That's the group where there is a high consumption and needs to reduce it. But other groups are actually under consuming that. And then, I mean, we can sort of change things. We can take our nutrition from others. But in low-income countries, people don't have other choice. There's a lot of diseases and malnutrition and stunting and all that is occurring because there is imbalance in the food. They have a lot of grains and nuts and stuff like that, but they don't have enough micronutrients like milk and eggs and meat. I mean, those are essential things. It has been proven time and again that they need to be part of the normal diet for people to have a normal growth. So, yeah.
We have something from Benjamin. Just gotta say, Dr. Kebreab, I'm a fan. Symbrosia is a client of mine. We can do this.
Great. Look forward to it.
And then we have another question. What is your future research?
So my research is now really focused on finding feed additives that are going to really be a big player. So I'm focused on various feed additives right now. We're working on seaweed, on Mutrol, on biochar, Agolin, and I have another 3 or 4 that I can't really talk about now because it's still under laboratory work. And so we need to do the actual work before I'm able to talk about it. But over the next 2-3 years, I will probably come up with data for 5-6 different feed additives, and at the same time working on a protocol to develop a protocol so that farmers can actually use them and get some credit for reducing the carbon. So my research has really shifted completely from I used to develop mathematical models and simulation models for methane, to understand methane. Now it's really on much more focused on the solution. Which feed additive can we use that will help us? It's not going to be just one. It could be a combination of one. So under what conditions, and really trying to move it and make it really practical. Get the feed additive, understand it, develop a protocol, and get it out there in a cost-effective way so we can reduce the methane emissions drastically.
Oh, that's very admirable. Are there any more questions? Oh, there is one more question from Rebecca. Was there a UCD scientist who was trying to trap the methane of cows to use as an energy source? Do you know what happened to that project?
Well, this is probably from manure. This is the anaerobic digester. So yeah, we have an anaerobic digester in Davis right now, where you will get manure and food waste and all that into the digester, and then it will produce methane, and that methane is then burned to use as electricity source. And the state of California is also really pushing for development of anaerobic digesters in dairies. And so that work is happening, and the state actually put in quite a lot of money to incentivize farmers to do that.
Okay, well, I would like to thank you very much for your presentation, Ermias. This has been really fascinating. It was just incredibly interesting to me, and I'm sure everyone who attended. And we really thank you for your time.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah.
Hi.
We're so grateful for you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,